on the show. It's just happened in the last hour or two. The guest who joins us now is a journalist who spent most of his life trying to understand the late TV presenter Jimmy Savile. Dan Davis spent hours talking to Savile, trying to prise the mask off a celebrity we always thought of as an eccentric, but who, since his death, we need to regard as possibly Britain's worst sex offender. Police have received hundreds of allegations of abuse and have said that, in effect, Savile groomed a nation. Dan Davis has also spoken to people who work with the DJ and the presenter, to some of the many, many men and women he abused. Goes right back throughout Savile's life to try and work out what made him tick. How did he hide the fact that he was a serial sex offender while he was doing it so publicly? Appropriately, the book is called In Plain Sight. Dan Davis joins us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So how did your interest start in Jimmy Savile?
Well, it started, I think, in 1980. I went to watch an episode of Jim Will Fix It being filmed at the BBC TV theatre in Shepherd's Bush, and at that time in 1980, Jim Will Fix It was one of the iconic shows on British television, and Jimmy Savile himself was like this Wizard of Oz-like character, a cross between the Wizard of Oz and Father Christmas for a nation, if you like. This sort of outing to sit in the studio audience and watch the television show being made was a treat, you know, for a 9-year-old boy. But I just found Jimmy Savile very odd. I found him very cold. I didn't sort of warm to this guy who was such an icon for children. And I just found his sort of place in the centre of that show. And I was only 9 at the time, so I couldn't really sort of, you know, probably quantify those feelings. But he just gave me a really odd and slightly uncomfortable feeling. And from that moment on, I probably would have ignored it had I not found, I think at a car boot sale or a jumble sale, a copy of his autobiography from 1974. And I read that in my mid-teens, and I just thought, this is so dark and so odd. And that was what really, the combination of those two events, the seeing Jim Will Fix It and having this sort of visceral reaction against him, and then finding a copy of his autobiography a few years later, was really what set me on this path.
And bizarrely, you then almost became friends with him in the sense that he allowed you into his life. You stayed in his flat in Scarborough. He let you stay in the room his mum had slept in. You went on a cruise with him. So you had a lot of what they call FaceTime with him.
I certainly did, yeah. I mean, I really grew to dislike Jimmy Savile before I met him. I first interviewed him in 2004, and by that time I'd amassed quite a lot of research and material on him. I mean, this was only sort of newspaper articles, interviews he'd given to magazines, stuff he'd spoken about in Top of the Pops annuals. I was sent to interview him in 2004 by the magazine I was working for at the time, and I was sort of going there trailing this baggage of really not liking Jimmy Savile. And then when I met him, he sort of took me on this sort of kaleidoscopic journey through his life, and he began to sort of turn me and sort of confuse me and lead me up blind alleys. And he was enigmatic, he was capable of being charming, he was also very elusive and very controlling. And even the controlling, particularly the first time I interviewed him, I arrived at his flat in Leeds. He came down in the lift from his penthouse apartment, flanked by 2 guys, one of whom was I think a serving police officer at the time, and had me frisked against the wall.
Well, I was going to say that's the first story that really made me drop the book in amazement, that you meet him, he's got a police officer or maybe 2 with him, and his first 2 words are frisk him, and they do it.
Yeah, I mean, this was, you know, they were there for his Friday morning club meetings, where we now know a lot of a number of serving police officers attended those meetings on a weekly basis. And I think that what Jimmy Savile was doing from the very outset was establishing the rules of engagement. You're on my turf, I'm in charge, I'm going to throw you off balance. You know, the last thing probably a journalist expects is to be pushed up against the wall and frisked. It was his idea of a joke, but it was certainly an example of how controlling he was. And that extended on through into the interviews. You know, whenever I asked him about detail or specifics or dates, he would get quite irritable and sort of shut me down. It was always really on his terms. He was sort of unfurling these stories he'd told many, many times and polished over a great number of years.
And we now know that he was abusing a lot of people. I saw the figure 1,000 somewhere, and we're not sure even what the figure is, but he clearly wanted to have sex with underage girls, and that's what drove him. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he started I mean, when he started, who knows? I mean, certainly he was doing this, he was involved in this sort of deviant behaviour from the late 50s. I found people who were in and around that dancehall scene in Leeds and Manchester who would testify that, you know, in the late 50s, Jimmy Savile was doing this sort of stuff.
Because he was, we should say, kind of a local sensation, because you describe how he had this idea of, instead of having live bands, you would play records, and people started coming to these events, and there were just loads of them.
Yeah, I mean, he pioneered what he called the record dance and what we probably know as the disco. You know, as you say, before it was live bands, then he started playing records, and he was aiming them at a very young audience, a teenage audience. He was a guy who was there at the sort of birth of the British teenager, that whole youth culture. And he preyed on teenagers, but he never sort of moved away from that. I mean, even at that point, you know, in the late 1950s, he was double the age of some of these people. He was 33 in 1959, and he was always a sort of generation beyond these pop stars that he associated with, the teenagers that he moved amongst in the 60s. And he never moved away from this behaviour. I mean, I think that when I was interviewing him from 2004 onwards, his offending behaviour had probably tailed off almost to a point where it wasn't happening. But certainly we know now that between 1966 and 1976, that was sort of when his offending was most prolific.
And the worry reading the book is just how he managed to get the authorities, and that's the BBC as well as the NHS and so on, all enslaved by him in some way. And I just wanted to mention one story which really struck me. When Otley in West Yorkshire had what they called a pop ball, or a civic ball, they decide to invite Jimmy Savile to host it. He doesn't, he wants a fee, but he takes the fee to charity. That's all interesting. He has 6 demands, and number 3 is that he wants to sleep in a tent outside the town, and he wants another tent next to it with 6 young girls in it, and the council end up choosing the girls. Is that right?
That's true, yeah. I mean,
it's just amazing.
These demands were made in the paper. This was in 1967. I think that, you know, it's always you've always got to be careful about viewing the past through the lens of the present. But, you know, his behaviour was illegal then as it is now. I think it was a lot more tolerated then, that sort of thing. I mean, you know, the guy the mayor of Otley, who sort of sanctioned these demands and agreed to them in a sort of very jokey manner in the local newspaper and facilitated Jimmy Savile with these girls on the hillside in Otley, said, well, we just thought it was part of his sort of larger-than-life persona. But, you know, I tracked down one of the, you know, she's a woman now, obviously, but one of the girls who slept in that tent, and, you know, Jimmy Savile's account of that, you know, that event in his autobiography was, you know, we had the great time and we all came down best of friends next morning. The woman's account was very different.
That he'd basically tried to attack them in the tent and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's just hear another part of the book in which you describe the experience of one of Savile's victims. She's visited him in his caravan in 1970, and one of our producers has read this section.
That summer, Jill, not her real name, was a newly married 19-year-old living in Brighton. She told me about one day receiving an unexpected visit from a man driving a Rolls-Royce. The man told her that he was Jimmy Savile's chauffeur, and his boss, who was making a personal appearance at Worthing Town Hall, wanted to meet her. Jill had been a member of Savile's fan club and had written to the disc jockey 2 years earlier, so she agreed to go. When Savile spotted her, she said, he put his arm round her waist and frog-marched her to his motor caravan, locking the door behind them once she was inside. She said, he was standing up, and it was weird. He said to me, "Oh, you're a beautiful little dolly bird," and I just sat there and thought, is this a compliment? I wasn't sure. He said, "I'd like to lock you up in my cupboard and take you with me everywhere I go." And I remember I just looked at him and I thought, this guy's a nutter. Then it happened so fast. He was on top of me. I was back on the bed and Jimmy Savile was on top of me. It was literally a fight. He was trying to rape me. He shoved my hand in his trousers. He had an erection, she says. His hands, meanwhile, were exploring under her skirt. According to Jill, Savile demanded to know whether she was on the pill, and when she replied that she was not, he got angry and shouted, "Why not?" After 20 minutes of struggle, Jill managed to pull herself free, and as she headed for the door, Savile asked whether she wanted to be a dancer on top of the pops, and said that she could take something from the motor caravan as a souvenir.
Now, she went to the police while Savile was alive in 2007. What happened then?
She went to the police and she made a complaint against Jimmy Savile, historic complaint about sexual abuse. and the police officers basically outlined what she would have to go through, and I think she felt that the frighteners were put on her. You know, she wasn't told that there were other, victims who had come forward. She felt that it would be her against Jimmy Savile in a court of law, and the really interesting quote that she said that the police officers gave to her is that Jimmy Savile's lawyers would make mincemeat of her. So basically she was, she felt pressured to climb down, and she basically withdrew the complaint.
And in the midst of all of this, he manages to get... Well, he sits on a watchdog for the BBC that advises on programmes and policy. He is on the... Is it the board of Broadmoor or Rampton?
He's on the board of Broadmoor. He's
got a room in the hospital.
Yeah.
He somehow manages to be the face of the BBC's religion department as well. Any others you want to say on this incredible CV?
Well, he was also on Lord Longford's commission on pornography.
Yeah, he put out a book called Other People's Children about how to keep children safe.
Yeah, he was somebody who gave party political broadcasts for two different parties in the election of 1974.
Met Mrs. Thatcher.
He was a confidant of Mrs. Thatcher. He was somebody that senior political figures across the political divide saw as a legitimate person who could reach out and communicate with the youth audience. He was somebody that Charles Haughey at the time believed could broker peace talks in Northern Ireland because of his contacts with not only the British government but senior members in opposition. I mean, he was by the 1970s, by the end of the 1970s, he was a man with significant establishment contacts.
Well, one thing I thought reading your book, Dan, is that clearly he did do a lot of what we might call charity work. He got himself into hospitals and else, and now we think he got himself into hospitals because he wanted to grope and attack sick people, including children. But is it possible that he did the charity work because something in him told him he was evil and he wanted to offset that?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, he released a book in 1979 called God'll Fix It, and this book was made up of a series of conversations with Reverend Colin Semper, who was a producer in the BBC's religious department. Jimmy Savile presented a show called Speakeasy, which was a quasi-religious show for BBC Radio. This book, God'll Fix It, outlined Jimmy Savile's views on religion and faith, and within there was a very, very telling passage where he talks about his life as a credit and debit column, and he talks about how he'd feel when he meets his maker. Jimmy Savile was a supposedly devout Catholic. He was a guy who was knighted by the Pope. And he talks about this credit and debit column in his life. So there's definitely this idea of having to offset stuff that he's done in his past, and I think he did have this very well-developed sense of Catholic guilt. On the one hand, yes, the hospitals did give him the opportunity to prey on, vulnerable people, and it also gave him a captive audience at a time when his sort of profile as a pop star had faded. But on the other hand, I think it did help, as you say, to salve his conscience, because he knew he knew the crimes he'd committed. He knew the pain that he'd sort of wrought on other people, and I think that this sort of relentless drive for charity was a way of offsetting that.
We are here in 2014, and a lot of people will think you could never get away with this now. A lot of people, though, look back on the 60s and 70s as an innocent time. What do we make of the period that he found his fame in? I mean, I ask that because there's one particular story where there's a show called Clunk Click, which is a road safety program. It's pretty much for children, isn't it, really? Teenagers. There were allegations now people were raped in the dressing rooms, and Savile was involved. And he interviewed Pan's people on one show, and then they show a little film where they're all scantily clad, and he's chasing them around a tree like Benny Hill, sort of pretending to try to grope them and everything. You'd never put that out on TV now.
Well, I suppose this is what I mean about sort of looking at the past through the lens of the present, because it does become distorted. I mean, we're talking about a period in the 70s where Benny Hill was probably the biggest comedian on TV, where, casual sort of sexism in the workplace and in society was tolerated, where, so many people I interviewed for this book, you mentioned the word paedophilia to them, and they say, well, we'd never even heard that word in the 60s and 70s. It was a different time, and that's in no way, shape or form a means to apologise or to, in any way find an excuse for what Jimmy Savile did, but, the times were different.
Did he ever hint to you that he'd hurt children?
No, I mean, I asked him about the rumours every time I interviewed him because, you know, those rumours were persistent. I mean, Lynn Barber, the very respected broadsheet interviewer and journalist, interviewed him just after he was awarded his knighthood in 1990 and asked him very specifically and very straight about those rumours. And Jimmy Savile's response was, "I'm off the hook, you know, the knighthood has got me off the hook," which was an extraordinary response to, you know, such an accolade and an honour. I asked Jimmy Savile about the rumours on every occasion I interviewed him, and he had a whole host of different ways of explaining them away or sort of bluffing his way through it. And what I realise now, looking back on them, is so many of those alibis, if you like, started from a point of guilt and worked backwards. You know, he'd say very odd things like, you know, I'd ask him, why do these rumours persist about you? And he'd say things like, well, the reason I don't have a computer in my house is I don't want the police breaking in and nicking my hard drive and accusing me of downloading pornography, which is a very, very odd way of answering a question about, you know, why do these rumours persist about you?
Well, now we look back on the whole thing, we can see it, can't we? You describe how in 1971 a journalist tracked Savile down to his caravan, which was parked, you say, as usual, in a seedy area by a refuse tip close to King's Cross Station in London. And Savile says, "I tramp around the country like a grey timber wolf. I'm a wild animal, aware of the world and its surroundings and aware of my own needs." Yeah. Sounds dangerous.
I mean, it is dangerous. I mean, this is the thing that, you know, the clarity that hindsight affords us, you know, throws the whole picture into sharp relief, and it is sort of deeply shocking when you look back at it.
Do you regret now that you didn't see it yourself?
Well, I mean, I didn't see it like everybody else didn't see it. I think that, you know, I was aware of the rumours, and the reason that I kept on going with this, and I kept on trying to find him, is I knew that I sensed that there was something, you know, here was one of the most conspicuous people in Britain, a man who sought publicity at every turn, in the way he dressed, in the way he wore his hair, in the jewellery, in the constant hunger for publicity, and yet nobody knew who he was. You know, he was an enigma. Nobody knew what existed beneath that sort of very distinctive exterior. And I did keep on going in terms of trying to unmask him, trying to find what lay within. I felt that there was darkness at his core, but I don't think anybody was prepared for the extent or the scale of it.
Thank you very much for talking to us. Dan Davis is the author of In Plain Sight, The Life and Lies of Jimmy Savile. I've read it. I'm going to say I recommend it. I just think if you want to see, I think it's as close as anyone can get to understanding what made this monster tick, and the detail in it is extraordinary. So thanks, Dan, for coming in.
Thank you.